So, for example, the critical theory famously engages in an analysis, a critical analysis of what it refers to as the culture industry. You might have heard that term before, the culture industry. And the culture industry is an industry that produces commodities that you buy, when you are engaging in leisure activities. So they analyze the ways in which, by means of the culture industry, capital itself and the logic and the rationale of capital infiltrates even the time that we spend, supposedly away from work, engaging in leisure activities. And the way in which capital attempts, first and foremost, to commodify all activities associated with our leisure time. Turn everything that we do when we're not at work into a process of satisfying needs and desires that we have by purchasing things, like going to movies, spending your $5 and, well, now it's like $12. Going to a movie, right? Critical theory incorporated elements of, Nietzschean philosophy, Freudian psychoanalysis, other theoretical models to assist them in their task of investigating not just how the economy functions, not just how stuff gets produced, but how society as a whole functions, how culture functions, and how culture has become infiltrated by capital, and how culture comes to reinforce capitalist relations of production, etc., etc. So these are the two theoretical models, main theoretical models, once again, that you see running through the history of Western Marxist thought in the 20th century. So the Italian New Left, which begins to emerge once again in the late 1950s, is something that is it's a different beast. It's new in that it's something different to these two competing theoretical models that dominate Marxist discourse throughout the West during, at the very least, the first half of the 20th century. So, the other important context, not theoretical context, but historical context, are the events that are taking place, some of which were just documented in the history lecture, in Italy in the post-war period. The end of the Second World War. We all know that the Second World War was very bad. It involved lots of people getting killed, lots of stuff getting broken by means of bombs and things like that. At the end of the war, Western Europe and Eastern Europe for that matter, even the relatively unscathed United Kingdom, England, tough economic times as a result of this massive investment, destruction really of wealth and material that took place during the war years, right? Not to mention the deaths of tens of millions of people. In Italy, Italy suffered greatly, as did the rest of the combatant nations during the Second World War. And by the end of the Second World War in 1945, the Italian economy, like the economy of all the other countries in Europe at the time, was in a shambles. Within about 20 years, though, and I believe this was mentioned in the history lecture, an event that was referred to at the time, and certainly is referred to as today, as the Italian miracle takes place. And Italy, that once upon a time at least had been considered the backward person in Western Europe vis-a-vis economic development. It was not considered to be an economic power the same level of certainly England or Germany or even France. 20 or so year period following the Second World War, Italy finally, by the end of that time period, it experiences rapid growth and development during those 20 years, right? And by the end of the 20 years, Italy is an industrial power comparable to the other industrial powers of Western Europe. Not as big in the economy, but comparable to the industrial power of, say, West Germany, France, England. It's produced at least two companies that are industrial powerhouses with worldwide scope, famously Fiat Motor Corporation, right? And Olivetti, which starts off like its American it's the Italian counterpart of IBM. Olivetti begins as a company that produces typewriters. And now it's a massive, like IBM, it's a producer of computers. So these companies, this sort of growth surrounding companies like these that emerge on the world stage in the 1960s are a couple of examples of what's going on in Italy in the industrial sector, beginning in the late 1940s, the post-war period, and through the 1950s and 1960s. So, in this context, what's wrong with critical theory by means of which we can analyze the culture as a whole and analyze the ways in which capital and the forces of capitalism are attempting to impose a certain kind of style of life, really, on all of us, and analyze the ways in which this is occurring to us. And what's wrong with Marxism-Leninism that provides us with a model to gain and hopefully maintain political power so that we can exert greater influence over working conditions, wages, and stuff like that? Aren't these two theoretical models sort of enough in order to help us, particularly in relatively prosperous Western nations, to figure out what's going on and how we might change things? Well, there are some problems. First, notoriously throughout basically all of Europe in the post-war period, communist parties were basically telling workers, frequently by means of trade unions that were controlled by the Communist Party in most of these countries, West Germany, Italy, France. Particularly in Italy, the Communist Party in the post-war period was telling Italian workers, guess what they had to do? Work really hard, because we have to focus on growing the economy, getting back to economic health, so that we can then, once that has occurred, we can focus on developing political institutions which will carry us into power. Right? But first things first, what we got to do is fix the economy, fix the industrial infrastructure. The Italians actually didn't have it too bad because, unlike Germany, for example, most of their industrial infrastructure is in the far north, particularly in the Po Valley and in the Piedmont area. The biggest industrial sector of Italy is actually a triangle with Genoa, Milan, and Turin. Before the war made it that far, the war in Italy on the ground starts in Sicily and then works its way up, right? Before it made its way up to the north, the Italians had taken care of Mussolini in their own inimitable fashion. And so the war ends really in Italy before there's a lot of destruction in the north. So actually the industrial infrastructure is pretty much intact in Italy at the end of the war. The Communist Party, once again, tells its good workers that it's supposed to be representing their interests, that we need to increase productivity, we need to accept wage concessions, lower wages, we need to work harder, work longer, and get the job done. And this sort of view of the function of the party is mirrored to a significant extent by communist parties in other parts of Western Europe during the post-war, the 2 or 3 decades following the end of the Second World War. So, hand in hand with this is the death of Stalin, which takes place in 1953. And the death of Stalin leads to, the Hungarian uprising of 1956, death of Stalin 1953, gradually leads to an erosion of support for communist parties in the West, because communist parties in the West, particularly the Italian party, had very much aligned itself with Stalin. And when the news starts to get out, when, for instance, when Khrushchev begins to sort of mildly criticize some aspects of the Stalin government, you've got representatives of communist parties in like Italy and France criticizing Khrushchev for being a traitor. This is how hardcore these people are.